I'm now going to cover relative clauses, which are fairly simple. They're not that complicated. There are some places where people do get confused, but they're not that big of an issue. These are a construction that are used far more often in writing than they are in speech. And they are used to define or explain a noun that comes in the sentence. These can be used to define or explain a person or often a thing. They can be used to explain what a place is or an activity or things like that, but they're most often used to really explain something about a person or about a thing. And that's where the relative pronouns come in. Relative clauses start with a relative pronoun. Those are the words like who, whom, which, or that. It also includes things like words like such as whichever or whatever. But the most common are the who, the which, and the that. The whom I'll discuss for a bit isn't quite as common, but it does come up. Those are the most common ones, the who, which, and that. And what they do is they come immediately after that noun that you want to explain, and they start off a short clause that's inserted right after that noun. It's not the main clause. Remember, the main clause of a sentence is always the independent clause. It's also not a dependent clause. That dependent clause is always set up by a subordinating conjunction. The relative clause is set up with a relative pronoun which acts as the subject of that relative clause. So the relative pronoun usually acts as the subject. Sometimes it can be the object, but it sets up the relative clause. So look for a relative pronoun to start it, and usually that relative pronoun is the subject of the relative clause. Oftentimes it's not, sometimes it's not, but it usually sets up a relative clause that's going to have a verb of its very own. That's not part of the dependent clause and not part of the independent clause. It's a verb of its very own. Okay? So let me go through how you could use it with who. You could have a sentence such as this one. The teacher arrived late for class. Well, this is an independent clause. Independent clause with an action verb. Teacher is a noun, and it's acting as the subject. Arrived is the verb, and it's acting as the verb. Well, I could describe the two nouns, the teacher or the class, with a relative clause. I could add on to the teacher or add on to the class. And here I've decided to add on to the teacher and tell a little bit more about him or her. And this is what I could do. The teacher who always marks me tardy arrived late for class. Who always marks me tardy. That is the relative clause. It starts with the who, and it ends with the tardy. The verb in this is marks. The verb in this is marks, and that verb goes with the who. That's the subject of the clause. Not of the sentence, but it's the subject of the clause. So keep in mind that old definition. I hope you can see now that idea that a sentence has a subject and a verb. It's very misleading because a relative clause has a subject and a verb, and yet it cannot be a sentence. It can't do it. So the who is the subject of marks, which is the verb. Notice that the independent clause can operate without it. The teacher arrived late for class. It can do that. This is additional information about that person. Oftentimes when you're writing in the second or third draft stage, you might want to add additional information about people or things that hasn't been mentioned in the first draft stage. Relative clauses are a good way to do that. You can add on to your sentences with these relative clauses, and that will give more detail and more specificity. You don't necessarily have to add more sentences. You just add relative clauses, and that fleshes out the ideas you already have and defines people and things better than they were in the first draft. So this develops your sentences. Especially if you're somebody who writes shorter sentences in the early draft stages, that's not a problem. You just develop them in any number of ways with prepositional phrases, with dependent clauses, but also with relative clauses, you can put these in to explain more about the class or the teacher or any other noun that's in your early draft of your sentences. Oftentimes, if you're dealing with figures who might not be familiar to your audience, you can use them for the people, for the people who are mentioned in your sentences. Or if you're dealing with items that might not be clear to your readers, you can define your items a little bit clearer with the which or the that. Those can be used. Okay? So another thing you can possibly do if you're in the second or third draft stage is look at a short sentence such as the teacher arrived late for class, and you could really change the main verb itself and incorporate this current verb into a relative clause. The teacher who arrived late for class. This whole who arrived late for class is now the relative clause. This who becomes the subject of arrived. Arrived is no longer the verb for teacher. Teacher is the noun and it is the subject, but what's the verb? Marked. We now have a different verb, which is marked. That verb goes with this subject, and notice the relative clause is inserted in between the subject and the verb. The subject and the verb have been separated by a relative clause. But if you think back to what I told you about originally about subjects and verbs, notice that teacher marked me tardy, notice that teacher marked, those still operate together. The subject and verb of a clause can be separated by a relative clause, by a prepositional phrase, or some other types of constructions, but they still work together. The most common way to separate a subject from a verb is either by a prepositional phrase that describes your subject, or by a relative clause that also describes your subject in a little more detail. So those are a couple of ways you can use relative clauses. I find they work best for students in the second and third draft stages when they need to add more detail onto the nouns. And using who, whom, which, or that is the best way to go. The whom I should mention, by the way, the who and whom difference. I do know a lot of people struggle with the difference and you might not quite understand it. But the who is when it's the subject of the relative clause. Who arrived. Okay? So that's the subject of the arrived. You would use whom if it were the object of the verb within the relative clause. If I said whom we thought was late himself, or whom we thought was mean, whom we thought was mean, notice with this one, whom we thought was mean, let me get that M in there, whom we thought was mean, the whom here is the object of the thought. The we is the subject, thought is the verb, the whom is the object of the thinking. Now, one thing I'll tell you is most people don't know how to use whom correctly. Most people do not. So if you just use who, most people won't notice that it's really not quite standard written English form. So if you are puzzling about when to use who and when to use whom, I would suggest defaulting to who because most people won't catch the problem. You will more likely be either be right or somebody will miss it and not really care about it. So only use whom if you're sure it's the object of the verb within the relative clause. Only go with whom if you're sure it's the object within the relative clause. Otherwise, I know it sometimes sounds a little more fancy. Otherwise, I wouldn't worry about it too much because most people don't catch it. If somebody catches you using whom when you should have used who, then it really looks like an error. But if you used who instead of whom, most people don't care too much. Okay? So use relative clauses to provide more detail to your writing in the second or third draft stages. Take care.